Hey all, welcome to the home we build, where we aspire to be a movement of men who build their lives on a firm foundation. Today we continue our conversation on intentionality in our finances, and we also have the Anvil dispatch and tough talks. Let's get going. The home we build. So 2 weeks ago, before Thanksgiving, we had started talking about intentionality in our finances, and we started off talking a little bit about why our finances and how that plays itself out in every single part of our lives, whether we realize it or not. And eventually, we started talking about the Dave Ramsey system, which Alicia and I work with. And I started working through the baby steps. I did baby steps one and two. Before I go back to the baby steps, though, I want to briefly review our working definition on intentionality, which is proactivity and prioritization, meaning we are seeking to do things in advance before they become emergencies, but also prioritizing things that are the most important. So, in review of the baby steps that where we had started talking with about Dave Ramsey and his system is starting with $1,000 in the bank, and getting that buffer in place between you and the rest of life, so that when challenges and emergencies come up, you have money there to be able to handle those issues. After that, we talked about how the next step is to pay off all of your debt. And this piece of it, we talked about quite a bit last time, but I want to review one chunk of this. I'm not actually sure that I talked about last time because the biggest reason why we want to get rid of all of that debt is because all of those payments that are going out the door on your debt is money that you can be using to invest elsewhere. And so when you have all of this debt on hand and you're leveraged, to use the fancy financial term, your monies that you get coming in from your job is immediately going right back out the door to someone else. And if we're not keeping that, we're not able to actually build anything for ourselves. And so the goal in all of this obviously is to start with a budget and to live within your means so that the money that's coming in is actually going towards the things that are important in your life rather than going out the door on something else that you bought and you're enjoying already, but you know what? It's sucking away from your retirement or your kids' college or whatever the case may be. So those were the first two baby steps, getting $1,000 in the bank and then paying off all of your debt. The other piece of this that I want to address as well before I move into the third baby step is there are some things that happen in life that are big enough that it's worth putting pause on some of your financial planning. And Dave Ramsey's program and his staff all encourage this same thing. And I bring it up partially because I'm going through it right now. Is that when you are expecting children, they use what they call stork mode, which is to say you you put a pause on wherever you are at in the baby steps. In this case, we're still working on paying off the debt. And that means we're now making minimum payments because all of the money that we would be putting out to our debt, we're saving so that when the day comes where we have these hospital bills for the delivery of our two girls, it gives us some space there to be able to save money that hopefully we can pay it all up front. Even if we can't, we're not burdened so heavily by those additional payments or whatnot that we can't make ends meet in life. So when there are certain things when I mean, if you have cancer, you're having children, if you're I mean that you're something major happens to your home or something like that. With some of these really big things that can occur in life, sometimes it's okay to have a dose of reality and say, all right, we got to work our way through this. And in the case of illness, get healthy again. And then we can keep working intentionally at trying to provide for our future and whatnot. So I wanted to just talk about that because I don't think I spoke on that the last time we talked about finances. So baby step 3 is to make a fully funded emergency fund. Um, by their standard, by Dave Ramsey standards, that is to say 3 to 6 months of expenses. Um, if you're self-employed, perhaps a little bit more. But that is to say the essentials. So this is not expenses based on steaks every night and lobster and the mo all of your streaming services and every luxury that you have. This is rent or in hopefully a home if you have one already, for your mortgage. This is your insurance bills. This is food on the table, utilities, gas, and maybe a smattering of other smaller things. And ultimately, the goal of this is that should you lose a job or should you have your your furnace go out or some other major catastrophe happen, that money's there and you unless something significant like that comes up, you never touch it. This is just a fund that in the case of significant emergency that you cannot make do otherwise, you can't budget around. This is an expense that you cannot budget around. That is when you would dip into that, and that goes to save you from these catastrophes, and so having that in hand will provide um, a lot of peace of mind as you go about going through life. After that, now in Alicia and I's case, we don't own our home, so at this stage in the baby steps is where you would start saving up for a home, and this is buying a home isn't one of the baby steps, but if you were if like us, just get started on this before you own a home, this would be the point at which you would save up that down payment, and he recommends a 15-year fixed rate mortgage if and when you go down that road. Um, so we will be doing that eventually. After that, and I can only speak to these so much, partially because I haven't gone through them yet. Um, and I would strongly recommend you go through his actual class. But for the case of for the purposes of our discussion, what I'm talking about, we'll do to give you a basic framework. After you get your emergency fund in place, after you if you are buying a home, you buy a home. At that point, you start investing 15% of your income into investments for your retirement. And this is the key to investing long term is consistency. It's not about riding one stock from the bottom of the market all the way to the top. This is about getting your money into he always recommends mutual funds that are diversified enough that you're going to withstand the ebbs and flows of the market, but have enough diversity as well that you will get those gains as they come. And you're not only using the big blue chip stocks, you're not only using small growth stocks. He he recommends it, if I remember correctly, it's a blue chip, it's a small chip stocks, international, and there's one more that I'm forgetting. I will put it up on a screen here shortly. I'll try to find what he recommends. I'm pretty sure there's 4. So that starts at the point of getting your emergency fund in place is starting to do that investment because compound interest over a long period of time is what is going to increase that amount of that nest egg that you have for your retirement someday down the road. Once you've accomplished getting your emergency fund in place and you've started to invest, investing shouldn't take this is not a task that should take months and years to accomplish. This should be all right. We're in our home. We've got our emergency fund now. You set up with your work that a part of your paycheck is going to go into your 401k or your IRA or whatever the case may be. And again, he breaks down all of the different strategies for this and the best safest ways to do it that is simple and not complicated for anyone to understand. Um, Once you've started doing that, then he recommends a couple of other things. I'm going to go through these last two baby steps because investing was baby step 4. Then you've got save for your kids' college. This is one that I strongly agree with Dave on a lot of these different things. I will say as the years have gone by, because he put out his total money makeover book, shoot, 30 years ago now or something like that. As the years have gone by and we see the way this world is going, I'm not sure that I'm not sure how valuable saving up for their college will be. Perhaps technical school of some sort or some sort of advancing education afterwards. All of that to say, putting some money aside for their continuing their education after high school, regardless of how that looks, is something that will help them move forward and you to leave a, a responsible legacy in life like God asked us to. So, baby step 6 is paying off your house early. Now, when you're thinking about if you've gone through all these baby steps and you have a 15-year fixed mortgage on your home and you saved for your kids' college, this becomes the last thing in your way from all of your income on an annual basis being yours to keep for whether it be retirement, for vacations, or giving, or whatever the case may be. And so, paying off your house early obviously is a lot less urgent than paying off your debt. Your debt, your money is going out the door to someone else, and you were not able to use that income to build anything for your future. Whereas your home, as you're paying it off, you're also building equity in the asset and you're owning more of the home. So the pain point is not quite as bad here. So, not that you shouldn't approach it with the same tenacity that you do your debt, but the urgency of it is not nearly as strong as it is with the debt snowball. That said, once you do pay off the house early, all of a sudden now your income is entirely your own. Um, Aside from your monthly bills of utilities and your property taxes and things like that. And that brings us to the last baby step, which is my favorite and the one I can't wait to get to, which is to build wealth and to give radically. And this is where I'm so appreciative of um, the Ramsey system because it is fundamentally based on the Bible, and that is to say, we give generously, and you can give beyond, and giving becomes a lot more fun because you don't have to worry about all of your other bills and obligations, and you can use the income you have to bless others. And so I looked at a couple different studies because I was curious about this, and one of the studies I was looking at actually was talking about how much people give to their local church. And I'll put the link to the study that I had or I was looking at in the description. But one of the frustrating things to me, and this is comes back to the Bible, in James chapter 1, verse 26 through 27, it says, Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This comes back a little bit to the whole mission that and aspiration I have for this podcast eventually is I want, if there's anything I can do to help reach the fatherless, it'd be the honor of my life to be able to do that. And that stems from these verses. And not everyone is equipped to be able to sit and, or it at least partially stems from these verses, but not everyone is equipped to sit and work with widows and orphans full time, and that becomes their career and their calling, and that's fine. However, churches and their congregants oftentimes give to ministries that do. Oftentimes, churches have ministries within their umbrella that cater to orphans and to widows and to people who are in distress and are needy, and they have food pantries, and there's all these different ministries that churches have that go to serve people in need. And going back to what I said earlier, I was looking at a study, and one of the things that the study was saying is that of people who go to church and are regular attendance, the average giving based on average income here in the States and people who would consider themselves Christians and attend church, the average giving is somewhere between about 2 and 5%, which is frustrating for me because, or at least mentally for me, because the the Bible is not really is pretty darn clear about how much as Christians we're supposed to be giving to our church, our local churches, which is 10%. When I sit and think about the amount of work that churches do in their communities, giving to the needy, giving to different ministries, giving to taking care of the people that attend their churches, and all and the congregations on average tithe somewhere between 2 and 5%. When I think about how far that 2 to 5% goes, it's unfathomable to me to think what would happen if everyone gave their 10% to church, their church, their local church. Their churches, now I'm not saying you shouldn't be careful about which church you attend and give to, because there are churches that don't believe the same things and don't aren't good stewards of money. But when you find a church that are good stewards of the resources that God blesses them with, I can't hardly fathom how far it would go if all of the congregation actually gave the 10% that God requests of them. And so one or two other things that I want, and I will put that again, I will put that link to that research that I was looking at um, in the description of the podcast this week. But one or two other things I wanted to um, share that I've picked up, one from Pastor Josh, as well as a couple different places over the years. Um, First is the idea of a what he calls a bless up fund, which is to say, in your budget on a monthly basis, some money getting set aside for blessing others beyond your the 10% that the Bible tells us to give. That 10% is off the top given to God as respect and honor for what he's done for us. Beyond that, then Alicia and I do this, but I'm not going to get into numbers at all, but to set some money aside on a regular basis that is available to be able to bless others beyond what the Bible tells us. So when and this is typically something that we do, and it's more behind the scenes where we're not trying to this is not something we're advertising that we're doing when it happens. It's something that we try to just bless without, let me put it this way. It's blessed to be a blessing, and all the money is God's anyways. And so I don't want to take the credit for those things. It is God's to God's credit for the things that He has blessed us with that we can then go and bless others with, and being a steward of the resources that He's given us. So having that in your budget allows for those more spontaneous instances of being able to fill a need is necessary, or that can bless someone else. That it provides space in your plan to be able to do that on a regular basis. In the end, God tells us to be stewards of His resources, and I know I've said this a couple times here, in different ways, but I want to say it very explicitly here: is God gives us everything that we own, and every resource, and every breath in our lungs, and every molecule that makes our body up. And so, at the end of the day, money is one of the easiest things for us that can hold us back from our faith in God, because giving is another, and I kind of talked about this last week with Thanksgiving, that thankfulness is an acknowledgement that God provides all these things for us. Giving is an acknowledgement that what I have physically is not mine, and submitting that to God in the first place gives a makes it easier to remember that everything else is a blessing that He's given us too. Because quite frankly, 10% is a small portion of the things that God blesses us with, and we get to live on 90. And if someone were to come up to you and say, "Hey, I'm going to give you we're going to have a deal, and you get to keep 90, and I get to keep 10," you're probably going to take that deal on most occasions. and and so the tithing is the least that we could do. And to be a steward of God's resources is to say, I trust that God is going to provide for me in every way. And to live that out, money become can be such a hindrance. And so I just want to encourage you to be intentional with your money, come up with a plan, talk about it with your spouse. If you're single, spend some time and work through all of the things that you have coming in and going out, and be intentional and make that plan. And again not sponsored by them, but I will strongly recommend you check out the Ramsey Network. They're a great resource for trying to work through all of this. But first and foremost, God blesses us with everything, and we need to remember that when we're being intentional with um, all the blessings that He gives us. So on the Anvil Dispatch this week, I want to highlight an article that I came across here. This was last week. It's in City Journal online. I will put a link to this in the description as well. But it talks about um, incarcerations, and um, the efficacy of prison, and the efficacy of punishment for crimes that occur in our society. And so I'm going to read a few excerpts, and I want to say a few things here. Um, and the article starts off with um, a individual who was put in prison for murder, and eventually got out, And after a number of years outside of prison and having somewhat built some trust up again in the community, ended up getting arrested for another murder down the road. And this article brings up a couple statistics and a number of things. I'm going to read a few excerpts, and I may interject a few things in between. But I wanted to highlight this because I thought it was an excellent article, and I wanted to go through a little bit about what this has to say. And so I'm going to start with this excerpt, which is a little bit of a some statistics and whatnot. And it says the overwhelming majority of Americans never engage in serious criminal behavior, let alone commit violent felonies like murder and armed robbery. But those who do are likely to do so again. The evidence shows. Indeed, crime's concentration is one of the most well established findings in social science. In 1972, University of Pennsylvania criminologist Marvin Wolfgang reported that just 6% of males in a birth cohort accounted for 52% of all police contacts. Violent crime, in particular, is overwhelmingly committed by young males. 30 years later, a similar study in Boston found that 3% of males were responsible for more than half of their cohort's arrests after age 31. The pattern holds across time and place. In 2014, data showed that three-quarters of state prisoners, the core of America's incarcerated population, had at least five prior arrests. Nearly 5% had 31 or more, a larger share than those imprisoned after just a single arrest. In 2022, the New York Times reported that nearly a third of all shoplifting arrests in New York City involved just 327 people. That is 0.004% of the population who had been arrested and rearrested more than 6,000 times. And in Oakland, a gun violence prevention group found that about 400 individuals, 0.1% of the city, were responsible for the most of the city's homicides. What I want to say about this, and the article continues to talk about a few things here, is that, I'm going to read probably three or four more little chunks of this, is that, and if we look at the Bible, there are people, or, well, I shouldn't even say that. We all are sinners. And one of the most profound challenges that I think we see is from us, we face as a society, and this is um, one of the key differences that I see that's kind of a contention in our society is the belief that we are sinners, we are fallen, and we are not inherently good. And there is a part of our society that believes that people are good and they progress and get better over time. And that's just not true. We, through our fallen nature, are sinful, and that we've talked about it a couple times on the podcast already. We're sinful, and there is only one solution to that sin, which is Christ's sacrifice on the cross for us. And God works through that sacrifice and our acceptance of it to produce good works and improve us as human beings. However, none of us ever end up at perfection. And even with the improvements that God works through our faith in Him and through the Holy Spirit, we're all still fallen. And so when we look at an article like this, and I'm going to continue reading here, not accepting that people are fallen can result in um, issues of catch, call it catch and release of criminals and being light on crime. I'm gonna continue reading, and I've got some other thoughts as well here. The article then goes on to quote a book called "Thinking About Crime." Um, I'm gonna flash up the name of the full name of the author. His last name is Wilson, and it says Wilson began from the premise that a community cannot flourish under conditions of pervasive disorder, Public policy, he argued, must therefore manage crime effectively enough to secure a basic level of order without utopian illusions, but with attention to cost and fundamental human values. Given crime's extreme concentration, this chiefly means separating the antisocial few from the pro social many. What the government can do is to change the risks of robbery, Wilson wrote, and to incapacitate those who rob despite the threats and alternatives society provides. Of the punishment not deemed legally cruel and unusual, only incarceration and capital punishment guaranteed incapacitation. Wilson became the leading voice of in the latter half of the 20th century, pressing for more prosecutions of the antisocial few and longer sentences to keep them off the streets. What we see here is that not one, humans are sinners, and because of that, and because of how the fact that there are actually people who are unrepentant in our society, admitting that becomes very important. And it then becomes government's job to punish effectively for the sake of the rest of society. And when government then goes soft on crime and people get upset about the realities of how prison can ruin someone's life. And this goes back to and what we're going to talk about a little bit in our tough talk segment today is when you commit a crime that is against the law, you break the trust with society. And there are consequences for your actions. And on a one-on-one basis with someone, as Christians, we are responsible to love them and to try to have some of God's mercy on them. Now, but it does require honesty about it, which is to say, if someone got out of prison yesterday for murdering someone, and on top of that, the government went very soft on their sentencing, I'm going to be much less willing to give them a long leash on behavior. However, if they served 40 years and they have been out of prison for 10 and have made something for themselves, they've had 10 years of building trust with society again, it becomes a lot easier to give them more leeway. And so when we don't go harsh on crime, you instead of the government punishing punishing them, the government puts the onus on the society to try to make the best judgment call that they can with someone who hasn't t- taken a just punishment for their crimes. And so I'm going to continue reading here. So it goes on as Thomas Sowell observed. As an aside, Thomas Sowell is a economist that is a supply side economist. He's written a plethora of books. He's on my list of authors that I want to start reading a few of his books. Um, but as Thomas Sowell has observed, criminal justice is the only field where the first question often asked is what benefits the criminal rather than what protects the law abiding public. Why? Wilson blamed the causal fallacy, the belief that no problem is adequately addressed unless its causes are eliminated. Embracing this fallacy turns policy on its head. A discussion that should focus on what best serves the community instead becomes a philosophical and anthropological search for the prime mover of antisocial behavior. Wicked people exist, was Wilson's conservative answer. That axiom is unacceptable to those unwilling to accept a moral view of human nature. And our discomfort with incapacitating the wicked has grown as the causal fallacy has taken deeper hold. And skipping one kind of irrelevant small excerpt here, and then I'm going to move on here. Um, the modern view wrongly treats crime as a dispute between perpetrator and victim. Television dramas that let victims decide whether to press charges reflects this confusion. In reality, prosecutors represent people, the political community harmed whenever one of its members is attacked or the law is broken within its borders. All of this to say, recognizing that there are wicked people in our society and that on some level the only good solution to that is to, as Wilson puts it, incapacitate them, which is to remove them from society. There are going to be some people who are unrepentant sinners, and either you can remove them, or there is the option that is, I mean, especially when it comes to flat out murder, the death penalty. And to the government should be in a position to treat crime appropriately to the point that it actually does instill a certain level of fear for retribution if a crime is committed. Because when that happens, crime goes down. And it is proven in every study out there that as punishments get harsher and punishments are prosecuted more frequently, people who would it does act as a deterrent for crime in general. And so as Christians in a one-on-one situation, we are called to love our neighbors and to treat them with respect. However, if if the government is soft on crime and doesn't give a criminal a punishment that is equal to the crime that was committed, it becomes a lot harder for people to then trust that individual when he leaves prison. And that causes all kinds of problems because there are plenty of people who will argue that there's not enough rehabilitation occurring and there's not enough effort put into um, trying to help these people readapt. And to that, I would say part of rehabilitation does occur from paying a just punishment for their crime. And to not give them that punishment is to encourage people to do the crimes to begin with. And so all of that to say, I thought this was a very interesting article, and it talks about about a number of other things as well. But um, I'll put that link in the description for you to check it out. But I just wanted to um, share this as it came across my plate that I thought this was something worth thinking about in terms of how we approach working, how we elect our representation, at least in part based on their stances on crimes and how they would prosecute and punish those who do commit said crimes. On Tough Talks here this week, I want to talk about personal responsibility. And this somewhat goes hand in hand with um, the article that I shared in Anvil Dispatch. But our actions ultimately have consequences. Everything that we do has some sort of a consequence. And that can be anything from committing a significant crime to sleeping in on a Saturday morning. All of those actions have consequences. And obviously, some are far more severe than others. Murder comes with very harsh consequences. That includes prison time as well as the consequences of being laden with a burden of ill will and distrust from society afterwards. And those are all justified consequences of the actions that was taken. Not doing well at your job can result in you getting fired. Smoking weed or drinking alcohol um, can result in laziness or underperformance. Um, Having unprotected sex has consequences, and that can be and that is raising children for both men and women. And I don't say that from a negative standpoint. Children are a enormous blessing and probably the biggest blessing anyone ever gets in their life. However, to sit there and have sex and not take responsibility for those consequences is problematic. And so my pastor puts it this way. I think this is very appropriate is when you're young, you look like your parents. When you're old, you look like your decisions. And it's so frustrating to me to hear people who they make decisions and it can be anything. And it can be I stayed out too late on a Saturday night and I missed something on Sunday morning or I missed an important job interview or whatnot. And they get frustrated because they're well the job interviewer just didn't have enough grace with me. Well, you shouldn't have shown up 30 minutes late. And to not take responsibility for your actions is one irresponsible, but two, it it promotes, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is this mentality of victimhood, and it causes worse results for you when you end up playing the victim card and then making poor decisions later on. And I'm not going to say there aren't um, situations in which life deals you lemons, but when you get bad things, and that's kind of the whole point of that saying is when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade because you don't sometimes the hand you're dealt in given situations isn't that great. And you got to make the best that you can. But that doesn't mean that the decision you make doesn't have the consequences that come with it. If you are given a bad hand and you make an even worse decision, shame on you. You get the consequences for your action. If you are given a bad hand, but then you make the best decision you possibly can, you're also going to get less worse consequences. And that difference in those results is where personal responsibility comes in. And when we take responsibility for those actions, all of a sudden we can start to thrive in life and to start to move forward. And so some of you might ask, well, and this is part of this podcast here is why am I not moving up in life? Why is the world seemingly against me? And to that, answer that question, those questions with a question of my own, which is to say, if you aren't or you never do take the responsibility for the actions that you have, how can someone then go and trust you with more responsibility? If you are constantly blaming someone else, blaming the situation, blaming traffic for showing up late, blaming some other circumstance for how you're behaving, the person that is standing in the way of you moving forward in life has no reason to give you that responsibility. And sometimes that's gonna and that those that can look very different from situation to situation. You can be given more responsibility and then you thrive at it and you do a really great job. But when the day comes where you're given more responsibility and you make a mistake, taking responsibility for your actions doesn't just come in the form of I did some potentially bad behavior and now there's some bad consequence for it. Sometimes it can be an honest mistake. And you know what? It may still have cost, but it may still have cost your company some money. And in those situations, to deflect and to say it was something else or some other person's fault is every bit as big of an error from a personal standpoint as not taking the responsibility for the poor decision that has the bad consequences. If you're given responsibility and you make an honest mistake and you then take responsibility for it, saying, "Hey, that was my bad. I made that decision and that was not appropriate." You or not it's necessarily not appropriate, but it was the wrong decision. You engender a level of trust because the people who are above you are going to look at that and say, "All right, he understands and he's able to learn from the mistakes that he has made." Going beyond even then just a career, personal responsibility then can even look and it's a career adjacent, but it's to responsibility can come in the form of risks that are taken as well. And to give an example from my own life, I have this candle business that I've mentioned once or twice here on the podcast. And my initiative to go out and do that does entail some level of risk. It is money that I have tied up into um, something that probably started out as a hobby. And we and Alicia and I invested some money in allowing me to get it off the ground. And with that risk comes a lot of responsibility of doing sales, running the operations, getting all the insurance and legal paperwork in place, getting um, the accounting books and stuff set up properly and working through all of those things. And those are chunks of responsibility that if any single one of those goes wrong, I can end up having problems with whether it be the government or with customers or with vendors or whatever the case may be. I can end up with consequences for myself. And that is responsibility I've put on myself. That isn't even responsibility that someone else has given me. This is something that I made the choice to do. But to take responsibility for it can end up in reward as well. And that is to say, if in a situation like this where I put the responsibility on myself, if I work through those things and take responsibility and do well with it, there is a reward in the form of compensation that comes from it later down the road. All of this to say, taking responsibility for your actions is key to moving forward in life and moving forward in your career and in your relationships and with your family. And I just would strongly encourage you to reflect on the decisions you make and if you're taking responsibility for them or not. And if you aren't, start looking for ways that you can take responsibility for those set of actions. With that, I appreciate you listening today. Um, like, subscribe, drop me a comment, drop me a message. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be dropping the article from City Journal as well as the study on the people and how people give to the church in the show description here today. Please, if this has been helpful to you, please share it with someone that you know. Otherwise, God bless, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.